All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's episode of Afterlife Apologetics Podcast with myself and Dr. Steve Miller. For those of you who don't know, he is a prominent Christian apologist, writes a lot on this topic, as well as myself being a student of his. We spend a lot of time studying near-death experiences, deathbed experiences, and what they have to say about the reality that we live in. And so what we've been doing last week is we were going through several lines of evidence for the reliability of essentially the evidence for these experiences being explainable by afterlife hypothesis as opposed to the dying brain hypothesis. Now, let's quickly explain these. The dying brain hypothesis is that when your brain dies, all kinds of chemicals are being released, electro signals are getting wacky, quantum physics is going wacky. So any number of combinations is happening from a natural perspective to create these experiences. So they can be explained away by essentially the brain's mechanisms going haywire. The afterlife hypothesis, which is ones that we are proponents of, is actually the complete opposite, that these people are actually experiencing a supernatural experience. Their soul continues on, their consciousness continues on past the point of death, and they're actually experiencing the reality that's beyond this reality, the supernatural. And so we are looking at the lines of evidence that help us determine which of these hypotheses more accurately describes the evidence, these 12 lines of evidence. Now, last week's episode, we originally wanted to get through all 12 in one. Obviously, that was way too ambitious of a goal. So we started with going through the first 6, and we're going to go through the last 6 here. So 7 through 12 today. Steve's going to go ahead and walk us through the first 6, do a very quick review, Steve, maybe 20, 30 seconds max on each one. And then we'll pick up from there. We'll start on 7 and proceed forward.
Okay, and I should mention that Charlie is not just a person that he's saying that he's kind of studying under me. You have a degree in your own right in apologetics. From where? What was your degree?
It's from Liberty University.
Liberty, okay, and a degree in apologetics.
Yeah, the degree technically in religious studies with an emphasis on apologetics.
Okay, so you've done your own professional study in this regard. Well, let's just look back at the what I called exhibits. It's kind of like you're in a court of law and you've got exhibit 1, exhibit 2, giving data. Now, personally, I don't know about you, Charlie, but people say, okay, well what's the data supporting the other side, naturalism? And I just couldn't really come across anything once I understood the experiences in light of the
Mm.
best research. I couldn't really see anything that just stood out to me that said, oh, these are here's evidence that it's really something naturalistic. Have you seen anything like that? I'm not trying to be one-sided here, and maybe I'm caught in my own paradigm, but
No.
I just couldn't say. I mean, people will say things, but to me, I think there's good explanations for them.
Yeah, no, I totally understand what you're saying here, Steve. In terms of trying to play essentially devil's advocate of like what's the strongest case, what's the steelman argument from the natural perspective. I think that if you look at potentially characteristics of the experience in a vacuum, you can make strong cases. For example, let's play this out. If I was simply trying to explain the tunnel, the light at the end of the tunnel, kind of this moving through a tunnel, you would begin to see hypoxia being a strong explanation. However, the issue lies in the fact that the tunnel is but one of many characteristics that these people are claiming to explain, in addition to some of the physical characteristics or the characteristics of the situation that induces the experience are all very different from one another. And so I think that if you were to try to say like what's the strongest position that a naturalist could take in trying to explain these experiences away, you would have to isolate characteristics of the experience and then try to focus in on them. It is when you bring in, it's when the afterlife hypothesis says, but how do you account for all of these characteristics occurring in multiple experiences to where we can get core elements or a core experience? Once that arrives on the scene, naturalism loses I think it's explanatory power immediately, because now it's saying, okay, maybe at best you're explaining one of 12 characteristics. And even then, you're not necessarily explaining that characteristics as complete and as wholly as what the descriptions or the testimony we're receiving describes it as. For example, they'd say, yeah, even though you might say that it was a tunnel being induced by hypoxia, I felt that the experience had a high level of veracity, or it was realer than real. And so therefore, I don't think that that's an accurate way to describe it, because people who do have hypoxia would say that it felt dazy, confused, dreamlike, and people just don't describe it in that same fashion.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. So, what you do when scientifically, you put up a hypothesis or you put up more than one hypothesis and you look at all the data, the best data, which in this case you find through the studies of near death and deathbed experiences, many good ones that have been done of thousands of experiences, and you see which hypothesis best fits the data. And to me, I don't see any strong evidence for it being something perfectly naturalistic, but I see at least these 12 lines of evidence that I mentioned in my book as supporting it. They just make more sense in the light of the afterlife hypothesis. So we'll just go back to review what we covered last week. Number one, reports from outside the body of the hospital room or accident location provide corroborating evidence. We gave several studies like Sabome's and others that found people seeing things they shouldn't have been able to see outside of their bodies during clinical death. Exhibit 2, NDEers, people who've experienced NDEs, report enhanced mental functions while their brains were severely compromised. It's not just that they're seeing things and conscious, but they're in a state of hyper consciousness that lays down perfect memories that are unforgettable at a time when their brain at least ought to be severely compromised. This convinced Van Lommel and many other great researchers. Exhibit 3, the presence of remarkably consistent yet unexpected elements are not what we'd expect from a psychologically induced dream state. So many of the elements of near death experiences are not expected, like, oh, I'm speaking mind to mind to people. I see this extremely bright light, but it doesn't hurt my eyes. What's that all about? So these are unexpected elements. Why would there be a consistency of unexpected elements if it were just purely something naturalistic? Um, Unexpected details, we talked about those. Exhibit 4, NDEs are not abruptly interrupted, distinguishing them from dreams and hallucinations. I said I tracked my dreams for a few months. Every one of them ended in the middle of some story, whatever my mind was putting together for the evening. And yet, near death experiences, if they were just hallucinations or some kind of vivid dream, why do they end at an appropriate time where you're talking about why should I come back or not? That's not expected under naturalism. So that was exhibit 4. Exhibit 5, children's near death experiences provide unique evidence, and that children don't have a well formed worldview. They don't have a theology of angels and the deceased and all these. We would not expect under naturalism for their experiences if they were formed by expectations and things they want. If a child's dying, he's going to hallucinate spending time with mom and dad or something. Why hallucinate a deceased relative that maybe they hardly even knew? So that is another point for the afterlife hypothesis. And then exhibit 6, deathbed visions provide corroboration. And I think we talked about that, and I ended up writing a whole book on deathbed visions. But you've got a partner experience or a sister experience that is different in some ways,
Mm-hmm.
not contradictory to near death experience, but people are experiencing many of the same things, which is kind of like another witness that we're lining up in a court of law.
Yeah, they have a lot of
So
similar themes.
yes, yes. And yet there are differences, so that
Mm-hmm.
are not contradictory. But hey, you're not finding people with life reviews when they're actually at their deathbed at their final death. Well, if they're all caused by hypoxia, why aren't they experiencing the same things as they would in a near-death experience?
Mm-hmm.
I think these are hard questions for naturalism. Which brings us to Exhibit 7. Shared near-death experiences provide multiple eyewitnesses. Now, one thing about the shared near death experiences, okay, this is like someone is experiencing some aspect of a person's death, typically totally unexpectedly, while the other person is dying. What this means is when people say, oh, well, hypoxia, like having too much oxygen, or eh, characteristics of the dying brain are causing this, in a shared death experience, this is not a person who is dying. They're not experiencing brain problems. They're not experiencing, they didn't just have a cardiac arrest. A perfectly healthy person is sharing in this experience with the other person, seeing, hearing, experiencing things that the other person did. Did I mention the Anderson family in Metro Atlanta?
No, no, you have
Okay,
not.
so this is Moody wrote a book on these experiences, on shared death experiences. I believe it was this one, Glimpses of Eternity, Sharing a Loved One's Passage. Okay. Moody's book on that. He wrote a whole book bringing them together because this is a special type of evidence. So there's this family interviewed from Metro Atlanta. They were at their mother's bedside while she was dying. Since this was the end of an extended illness, none were especially psychologically distraught at the time. It wasn't like, oh, they just had a traffic accident, something happened. They had been seeing her through this whole process. But as one of the daughters reported, quote, suddenly a bright light appeared in the room, end quote. The appearance of the light was unlike, quote, any kind of light on this earth. Again, unexpected. You might expect to see light when somebody's dying, I don't know, but a different kind of light than you've ever seen on the earth. I nudged my sister to see if she saw it too, and when I looked at her, her eyes were as big as saucers. I saw my brother literally gasp. Everyone saw it together, and for a little while, we were frightened. End quote. So then they next saw lights that shaped themselves into an entranceway. Her mother left her body, departed through the passage, ushering in a feeling of ecstatic joy. They all agreed the entranceway resembled the natural bridge in Shenandoah Valley.
Mm.
Uh, so, okay, here's an experience where it's not the dying person necessarily experiencing, at least that's not the report. I'm sure she was experiencing that as she was dying, but these are perfectly healthy people who are surrounding the bedside, and it's more than one person in this case that's giving evidence that this is what they saw. They all agreed that they saw it. So this is pretty powerful testimony to me. And in fact, I saw a friend passed on an article, 2021 article reporting experiences, shared death experiences of like 164 people. It's in the American Journal of Hospice and Palliative Medicine. So this was a recent study bringing it. So you can't just say, "Oh, well, that's just one of those 1 out of 1 million episodes," and Moody just happened to find a few of them to put in a book. Here's somebody evaluating 164 of them. So, what does it strike you about shared death experiences? Anything other than what I'm saying?
Well, I think, I'd want to push back on you a little bit and see kind of how you would respond to the suggestion that these people are under psychological stress. So, a way and means by which to provide solace to themselves is, if I'm coming at it from the dying brain
Hmm.
hypothesis to say, okay, this person's having a dying brain, and so therefore this dying brain is producing all kinds of randomness, and that's where we get this result from. But what about these people in the room? I mean, they're under such emotional distress that they're starting to create kind of these cathartic experiences to help themselves feel better.
And I think those are the exactly the type things that we need to hit head on and think about. And in this case, I would say, well, certainly, sometimes somebody might imagine like people will talk about a mist coming up, apparently, or something almost ghostly that comes up out of a person at the time of death. There are a lot of types of these. And I could see if it's something kind of mystical in a hazy way, and somebody says, well, I saw them die, and then I saw this. maybe you're wanting to see something, maybe you're
Mm.
expecting it, maybe some cigarette smoke wafted in from the other room and happened to do it. And if this happens once or twice, you could explain it away with this type thing. But instead of some kind of just mystical smoke, we're talking about something very, very specific, a light coming in that's unlike a light. You see, at first, one of the people thought, well, maybe there's a passing car or something and it shined its lights in. But they said this was unlike any kind of light I'd seen before. And there was this entranceway that was a specific, very specific shape. It was kind of like, and they all agreed upon it, several of them. So this is very different from something that I think just one person would manufacture in their minds or let themselves be deceived by at a point when somebody's dying.
Yeah, I would take that same approach, Steve, because it's in my mind it's very similar to the idea that the disciples hallucinated seeing Jesus
Mhm.
once he was risen from the dead. The idea that one of them saw him would seem to lend itself to the idea of, okay, maybe they were just hallucinating him. Saw him together, they all ate with him together, they all done acts together. Now we're getting into the territory of like this kind of group hallucination. And so when we look at these shared death experiences, again, it would be to me sufficient to say, okay, maybe one person in the room is seeing something that they find solace in, and so this emotional distress is resulting in this vision. However, if you see three, for example, in the story that you told, where you have three witnesses all seeing the same thing, now I think that really hurts the idea or the explanation that this is just simply some kind of hallucination. It's if these three people are seeing an experience, and like she said, she nudges her sister, and her sister's sitting there with her, kind of mouth wide open. It it seems to me that group accountability, that group testimony, grows in its reliability. And how many, I don't know if you know this, but off the study that you were citing, how many occurrences are there where there's multiple witnesses to something like that happening?
I'm not really sure.
Mm.
So in fact, somebody just shared it with me the other day. I downloaded the article through our university, and I still need to read the article. But one thing I should mention is that not all shared death experiences, maybe most of them, are not really at the bedside. So at the bedside, you may have very well some expectations going
Mm-hmm.
on that you need to consider when you're evaluating the experience. But there are many that are happening outside the hospital room with people who do not even know a person is dying.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't really throw in the expectations with that. Like I've mentioned a couple of times, my cousin Bucky, who was lying in bed, and I think it was 3 in the morning, when boom, he feels like something huge has just landed on his chest. He comes out of his body, sees some angelic beings, sees a light in the corner, comes back into his body, wakes up in a cold sweat, and then boom, the phone rings and somebody says that hours away, his this was a nurse calling to say that his dad had just passed away in a hospital hours away. Bucky didn't even know his dad was ill. So you can't very well blame a person waking up in the middle of the night on some expectation they're having. They're in the middle of dreaming. They're not even
Mm.
thinking about that. So when you look at the wider body of material, I'm not sure which percentage are at the bedside, which percentage of shared death experiences are actually remote. But this remote thing happens to a lot of people. I was sharing to primarily a group of, I believe, hospice people at Kennesaw State University on this. And one lady at the end, we had a sharing time, and she said, I think it was her husband that had died, and her daughter calls and says, "I just saw my dad.
Mm.
Now what's going on?" Said, "Well, he just died, Well, I just saw him, come into my room." The wife's a little bit jealous. Why didn't he appear to me,
Yeah.
But there are these crisis apparitions that happen at the time of death, and sometimes you'll be on a different continent from the other person. I think it's pretty powerful testimony that's consistent with an afterlife hypothesis, saying these people are actually leaving their bodies and saying goodbye to some other people or letting others see. I don't make as much sense with it from a naturalistic dying brain hypothesis. Their brains aren't dying.
So do you feel like this line of evidence is more admissible on the grounds that you have essentially 1 through 11 lines of evidence, and so then you find crisis apparitions in there and you say, okay, with crisis apparitions, this by itself may be not as heavy of a hitter, but when you consider these other lines of evidence and now you add this onto the pile, and now suddenly it has more power? Or what do you think? Does that make sense?
I think it increases the power. I actually
Hmm.
think that crisis apparitions, which we'll deal with when we get to the Deathbed Experiences book in more depth, some such excellent studies have been done on that that I think that is a very strong line of evidence in and of itself.
Okay.
And then you
Okay.
combine it with the other near-death experience evidence, and you say, wow, this just they mutually increase the power of one another
Okay.
because it just
Yeah.
makes sense in light of the afterlife hypothesis.
Yeah, I'll look. That'll definitely be a good one where we actually get to go through the studies for it, because I think that will help establish a lot more legitimacy to it.
Yeah, because they were actually able to get into math, which helps solidify what they were getting from this experience. And all
Okay.
our math geeks can go, whoa, let me think about that. Exhibit 8.
Yeah.
Face-to-face interviews have a strong impact on researchers. Now that's kind of weird as a line of evidence in a sense, but when these are typically scientifically that they've studied the sciences. These are physicians or academics. A PhD is a degree in research. It's a research degree. So these are seasoned researchers, scientific thinkers, and like Moody had 2 doctorates, one in philosophy and one in medicine, psychiatry specifically. But when Moody saw these things, he grew up in an atheistic environment. They weren't big churchgoers that had a strong background in the Bible or anything. His dad was a surgeon who was also a an atheist, and so he didn't have a big background in this. But when he began to interview people with these experiences, they just impacted him. And he's very philosophical. I asked him about this one time on the phone. I said, "Why did it take you so long to decide that these were really the afterlife?" He said, "Well, I was afraid that if I came to a decision that I'd stop searching."
Hmm.
So he
Yeah.
was just kind of like a Socrates who's always questioning, and he wants to always be questioning. And he would say at the end of his books, "Well, I don't know what these are." And you're like, "Well, you just gave all this evidence. Why aren't you coming to a conclusion?" But eventually, it overwhelmed him. The evidence overwhelmed him. Same with Van Lommel, the same with Sabone. These people were not Christians trying to defend their faith. They were scientists who were trying to come to terms with an experience that seemed to speak against their reductionistic approach. So it just the fact that so many of these researchers are people who came out of more of a naturalistic approach,
Hmm.
and interviewing the people impacted them so much that they said, something is going on here and I can't get away from it. I think that speaks as a line of evidence in itself.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that that was the motivation behind them starting the research, was noticing these phenomenon emerging from it, and then saying, okay, there's something going on here. No, they began noticing a pattern, and then therefore they could see some data coming out of this. And so I think it's important to say that it's like, well, they went into it wanting their minds to be changed. Not at all. I think most of them, when they go into it, they make it clear that they had these phenomena that were so compelling and curious that they said, why not take some time, like Moody, to study it and realize, okay, there is something in fact going on here, and it has characteristics to it. It has a pattern to it. It has all of these elements that I think are very important. And oh, by the way, other studies done in different settings have reproduced this. And so I think that that's where you really start to see this mountain of evidence start to stack up and raise some very serious questions about what the implications of all this data is. And then you on top of that, right, you have these researchers who walk away from it at the very least saying there's something more going on here. This is
Mm.
not just some physical thing. This is, some of them will only go so far as to say, something metaphysical is happening here. But nonetheless, I think that's good enough to open the door to say, look, there's something supernatural at play here, and what it is exactly is what I think we're all trying to figure out.
Right. So Dr. Long, for example, who has the NDERF site, NDERF, where he's collected over 5,000 experiences that people have submitted.
And growing.
His search it just keeps growing.
Mm-hmm.
So his search started when I believe he and his wife had over a couple when he was much younger, and one of them shared about their experience. And he thought, I guess he just thought through it like any rational person and thought, okay, well, this is a couple we respect. We know them. They're sane, and she's talking about this experience. And he said, if something like this really happened, this could revolutionize our idea of the body and soul. This could revolutionize our idea. This is something that we need. And he thought, someday I need to study this. And
Hmm.
eventually, indeed, he did. But these are very wise, very well studied people that are, Sam Pernia and others, some with double doctorates, teaching in academia. When they take the time to study this for years and they become convinced that this is talking about people actually exiting from their bodies, I think that's another line of evidence that needs to be considered.
Mm.
Um, Exhibit 9, the deaf ear.
Mm.
Okay, so here's an account of a boy who is born deaf, describing his near-death experience. Now, it's not that he went deaf later in life, where his mind still has memories of what it was like to hear clearly. He said, I was born profoundly deaf. All my relatives can hear, and they always communicate with me in sign language. Uh, Now, I had direct communication with about 20 ancestors via some kind of telepathy. It was an overwhelming experience. So he had this direct communication, not through sign language. That's the way he was communicating, right? And then all of a sudden, he's having this direct, clear communication with deceased relatives. Well, he said it was an overwhelming experience. Yes, he had never heard before. And then in his experience, he hears. Exhibit 10, the colorblind see colors. I'm fairly colorblind, as well as being a fashion idiot, so I depend on my wife to pick things out for me. Um, but it would be so profound if I went to the other side and actually saw colors that I'd never seen. Isn't that something?
Mm.
And that's one of those kind of ineffable things. And people will talk. I remember interviewing a boy in Ukraine, the son of a missionary. A snowbank had fallen on him, and he experienced clinical death. Came to, but he was telling me about the colors that he saw on the other side,
Mm.
and then they'll talk about colors that I've never seen on this side. I can't really describe it. Well, in my dreams, I'm sure I see some colors, but I've never had a dream where I said, "Oh, I saw a color that I've never seen before," because my brain is pulling from my dreams from what I've already experienced. I think that's all it's got to play with.
Yeah.
And yet, if you go to the other side and you're seeing colors you've never seen before, this seems to distinguish it from a hallucination or just a vivid dream.
And
But
I'll say on that, Steve, that with Kenneth Ring's book Mindsight, he does pull people from varying colorblind or outright blind backgrounds. So he gets some people who are born blind. He gets some people who became blind early on in life. So he has a wide range in his study. Kenneth Ring is one of the more famous NDE researchers, and so he that's a great study to go look at when people are wanting to look at exactly what was found from these blind people's near death experiences.
which brings us to Exhibit 11, the
Nice.
blind see.
Yeah.
Nice transition
There we
there.
go.
So, researchers studied 31 blind people Not all of them were blind from birth, but nearly half of them were blind from birth. So this is Exhibit 11, the blind see. Um, now, I mean, this is pretty powerful evidence because if you look at it, let's see, I think it was Vicky that described her experience with sight. She said, "I was born blind. Then she fell into a coma at the age of 22 after a car wreck." According to Vicky, this is coming from that study you were just talking about, the
Mm.
book
Mm-hmm.
written on it. She said, "I've never seen anything, no light, no shadows, no nothing. And in my dreams, I don't see any visual impressions. It's just taste, touch, sound, or smell, but no visual impressions of anything." And people will say, "Well, what do you see when your eye? I mean, do you just see darkness?" I said, "No, I don't see darkness. I don't see anything. I don't know what darkness looks like, right?"
Mm.
I mean, this is profound blindness. And yet, after the wreck, she found herself viewing with perfect clarity a scene in the emergency room where a medical team was frantically working to revive a person. She recognized her wedding ring, which she knew by touch but not by sight, began to realize that the body was hers and she must have died. She went up through the ceiling and saw trees, birds, people for the first time. It was incredible, really beautiful. And I was overwhelmed by the experience because I couldn't really imagine what light was like. End quote. Before coming back, she went on to meet some of the people who had preceded her in depth, in death. So, I mean, this is now Dr. Van Lommel, the physician from Holland who did the study that was published in the Lancet. He said, speaking of blind people having sight, he said, "This is impossible according to current medical knowledge. Vicky's reported observations could not have been the product of sensory perception or as a functioning or of a functioning visual cerebral cortex, nor could they have been a figment of the imagination given their verifiable aspects." So they were able to actually verify that some of these things that she saw, however she was seeing on the other side, were actually happening here. So this is pretty powerful evidence. How could this have happened from a naturalistic perspective? Maybe you could come up with some way that something like this might have happened and it just happened to correspond with reality, but it seems to be a vast stretch, much more consistent with the afterlife hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Any other things on the blind seeing?
No, I think that was a great detail. I would have forgot to mention that they are actually able to verify some of the things that she saw. And I think it's important to note, people want to talk about, well, how can they know what things are if they haven't seen them? So, someone who's or has never actually, like, they don't have the idea of visually, like, for example, she says a wedding ring. A, the human brain still has the ability to conceptualize something even though we can't see it. For example, if you closed your eyes and I handed you something that you'd never seen before, you could touch it, feel it, smell it. You could use all these other senses to kind of start to be like, okay, I think it's this. So for her to be able to kind of come out and be like, start putting a vision to the things that she had always known intimately through touch. For example, a wedding ring. I mean, think how often one would touch a wedding ring, brings a lot of validity to the experience, because they do make this note a lot. And I think this is an easy thing to slip past, which is, oh, well, how would they know what that looks like? How would they know what a car looks like if they've never seen a
Good
car?
point.
Right.
Good point.
But it's important to understand that the human brain, and this is really becoming a big deal with AI, is human brains can conceptualize something in a pocket. For example, if I said, hey, I have a $20 bill in my pocket, you could kind of in your mind visualize a $20 bill on the inside of my pocket. And if I said, hey, reach into my pocket to grab the $20 bill, you could then visualize a hand going into the pocket and kind of what a bill would feel like and what the space would be like. So you can begin to conceptualize spaces, versus AI doesn't have the ability to do that. So I bring all this up to just say that it would make sense that blind people would have some conceptualization of the world around them. It's just when they have these visionary experiences or these deathbed experiences where they're able to have vision in them, they would start to be able to kind of put two and two together and be like, oh, that must be my wedding ring. And oh, that must be a car. Oh, so on and so forth.
And so they've conversed with people all their lives. They've probably been
Hmm.
reading in Braille or some way, and you know the concept of a bird. You may have
Right.
felt you may have felt somebody's
A feather or
structure of a
something.
bird,
Yeah.
and you know that they have wings and they fly and they light on trees. So when you, in the deathbed experience, see this creature that's flying with wings and lighting on a tree limb, you're like, oh, that's what everybody's been talking about when they talk about
Yeah.
birds. I
Yeah,
know what that
exactly.
is. I've just never seen one, but oh my goodness, now I know what it looks like.
And I
How
wanted to
fascinating.
add to this, like this becomes a huge problem for, guess what? The dying brain hypothesis. Because how can, if you think about it from the terms of it's just reconstructing from the information it has, how can a blind person start to construct data they've never had? How can a deaf person construct
Right.
data that their brain has never had? How can a colorblind person construct with information they've never had? So again, it's this it's this data that shows up from unknown sources that begins to raise the question of this must be new experiences being had by a consciousness beyond death.
And I'll give you the name. I mean, this is such an interesting thing. Kenneth Ring, Ring, and S. Cooper, Cooper, 1999. Their book is Mind Sight,
Yeah.
Mindsight, Near Death and Out of Body Experiences in the Blind. So some of you may want to check that out. So the blind see. And number 12, this is kind of, I've got kind of a little take on this one. Exhibit 12 is extremely convincing to the one who experiences it, completely unlike a dream. Now, at first you think of that and say, well, people are convinced of a lot of things that are non existent, you know. So how does that fit in? How is the extremely convincing aspect of it part of your evidence? Well, I would say it like this. Okay, one of the characteristics of these experiences, at first, if someone tells you about it, they're probably a little bit concerned that you'll think they're crazy. So they're kind of tentative in expressing, okay, I saw this, or whatever, whatever, what do you make of this? But then if you say, okay, well, what is your degree of certainty that this was really not a dream and not a hallucination? Very typically, people will say, It was real. It was realer than real." They may say, "It was realer than me talking to you right now." That kind of real. Okay, so I'm a philosopher, and I sit down and smoke on these things with my philosophical pipe on the back deck and think about them. Okay, so what is realer? So how do I distinguish reality from the reality that I experience in a dream? Well, when I wake up, I
Mm.
realize a part of it is that it wasn't as clear as reality. I know that I'm not dreaming right now. Why? This is realer than a dream. So if somebody says that their experience and their near that experience was even realer than this, I'm saying, okay, well, at least that person is convinced that it was real. They really talked with an angel. They really were outside of their bodies. They're convinced. Now you said, well, that's their experience. If I ever have one of those experiences, maybe I'll come back saying it was real too. Well, why should you have to wait for the experience? I mean, if you trust this person, and these experiences are so common that 4% of the United States has had a near death experience, over 80% of the population, when they're dying, will probably be having a deathbed experience, and they're going to say it's realer than real. Why not trust in your future self that is dying one day, who will probably have such an experience, and you'll be saying, yeah, it was real, you know? And if this is a person I trust, I can say, okay, had I had that experience, I think I'd be saying the same thing. They're just as rational and informed as I am. If they're saying it's real, had I had that, can't you empathize enough with another person to say, I think I'd be saying it was real too. So I think, again, just because somebody says something was real, like they were abducted by aliens or whatever, doesn't make me automatically believe them. But in conjunction with all these other evidences, when somebody says, no, it was real and it was a trustworthy person that I fully respect, I think that is another line of evidence as well. Does that make sense to you?
Not entirely, if I'm being honest, Steve. I mean, try to help me understand a little
Push back
more.
on it.
Well,
Sure.
so you're saying that the the veracity of the experience itself lends credence to the evidence? Is that what you're saying? Or
That they're saying this was okay. Let's say if a lot of these people were coming back saying, I had this experience, and might have been a dream, might have not been a dream. It was kind of fuzzy, but I
oh,
think there was
okay.
this creature that might have been an angel. I'd say, okay, well, maybe it did happen. Let's look at the other evidence
Mm-hmm.
and see, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. But when they come back and say the degree of certainty they have is this is more certain than anything I've ever experienced in life. If this is a person that I respect, I'll say, well, I need to take that into consideration. That's a line of evidence to put in with the others because of their degree of certainty and
I
because I
Yeah.
trust their character.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I see what you're saying now. So, because of the sense of assuredness of what they experienced being so real, then and you see that as a commonality. You see that as a common thing that they're explaining across all of these testimonies is people have a very high sense of assuredness that this experience, again, you guys probably hear us use this phrase all the time, realer than real, and that's just because that's how people come back describing it, and that's the most succinct way to speak to kind of what Steve's talking about is I'm so sure it was real because it was more real than this is real. And I guess to give a parallel here, I get what Steve's saying here, which is how sure are you when you wake up that you're awake,
Mhm.
right? Like if you were asleep and you were dreaming and then you wake up, how do you know that you're awake? It's the realness of your world around you, right? Suddenly you have much better ability to grasp things, to remember things, to have clear thoughts, to control the movements of your body, control the movement of your eyes. Reality doesn't start to have this kind of randomness around you. It has more of a steadfastness to it in that, your bed's there, your room's there, it's a familiar setting. So again, it's all of these characteristics of reality that make you so sure that you're in reality and no longer in a dream that's continuing forward. And so I think what Steve's trying to say is the fact that people bring that same level of assuredness, the level of assuredness that I'm no longer dreaming, I'm now awake, they bring that same level of assuredness from these experiences back to the living with them, that we have good reason to consider that as it in and of itself a line of evidence versus, and you say, well, what's the opposite of that? The opposite could be that they'd come from these experiences and say, I'm not really sure what it was. I'm not really sure what happened. I'm not really sure it was a different reality. You would still be able to line up all of these testimonies and say, okay, even though they're not sure it was real, I can still look at these thousands of testimonies and say, well, based off of the characteristics, the pattern, the core elements, all of these things that line up, the corroborated reports of them saying, oh, I saw a shoe on the third window outside of the hospital, and that was corroborated by other people who went and investigated. I think it's safe to say that they were experiencing something versus they're saying, yes, all of that's true. You have all these other lines of evidence. In addition to, you have the line of evidence that they are so sure that it occurred, they are so sure that it happened, that they would describe it as a reality more real than the one that they're currently experiencing. And so that to me is, I would agree. That is 100% a line of evidence. And we would refer to that, or at least I refer to that in my book as the veracity of the experience, in that it is so real. You could not convince these people that it was something unreal.
No, and they will sometimes say you could never. There's nothing you could say that would convince me otherwise because
Yeah.
they were there, they experienced. Okay, let's compare it to legal evidence. Same, we deal with this all the time. If you have a witness who says, I'm pretty sure I saw that guy at the scene of the crime. I mean, he was about his height, he had a similar face.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was him. Okay, the jury's going to look at that and say, okay, 60% chance it was the person. I don't know, but I'm not real sure. But then if you have several others who chime in and say, no, I saw that guy and I know him. He's my next door neighbor, or I know him. I see the guy every day at work. I'd know that guy anywhere, and I saw him 100%. He was there. Well, then the jury's going to listen to that and say, okay, the jury didn't see it happen, right? Just like in a near-death experience, somebody evaluating it from the outside. The jury didn't experience it, but that helps to convince them that they really saw the person because of their degree of certainty in it.
Yeah.
So that is a part of what goes on in a court of law. You've got to deal with degrees of certainty. This is a major degree of certainty. And if you
That's
want to get a little bit weird and philosophical, let's think about, are we really experiencing reality right now, or am I in the matrix?
yeah. The Matrix
I
theory.
don't know. There are multiple hypotheses as to whether what we're experiencing right now. Are we really having an interview,
Yeah.
or is my brain just in a test tube
Yeah.
somewhere that an
Yeah.
alien
Yeah.
is working on? I would say that the vividness of my present experience, because of that, I'm warranted in believing that this is reality. Surely we're warranted in accepting these other people's reality if they've seen it with at least the reality that we're experiencing now.
Yeah, I think it would be akin to trying to convince someone that their childhood was
Never
made
really
up.
happened.
Yeah, it never really happened. Like your childhood, as much as you think it was real, let me give you all of these explanations as to why that's all made up, and that makes a really good science fiction movie. But when you put that into reality, the likelihood that you're going to convince someone of that to be true is extremely. Well, I don't even think it would be possible, to be honest with you. Not without like really undoing them in some different psychological fashions. But anyway, the point of this is that if I have a high level, and Steve makes a good point, to go back to the kind of the legal example, it would be like you bring the evidence on the stand, or you bring the witness on the stand, and you say, did you see them from behind? Did you see them from the front? Like how sure, like you said, that was your neighbor, how sure are you? And if I'm prosecuting you, if I'm trying to like kind of tear your testimony apart, I'd say, well, how did you see them? How far away were they? Or what were they wearing that day? And if the person's on the stand's like, oh, I think it was a red shirt, and I saw him from behind, then I could be like, well, then how really sure were you that that was Johnny from down the block? Versus if that person on the stand was like, he had a red shirt, I was so sure that that was Johnny from the block that I waved to him and I said, hey, Johnny from down the block. You would both people are saying they saw something, but the one that has a much higher level of confidence in what they saw and maybe some characteristic descriptions of it, you would be much more likely to believe that testimony.
I'm with you on that. So that these conversations are good because I've not brought in the legal evidence and all that to this thing, but when we get to talking, it just brings out more angles as to why we think this is a legitimate line of
Yeah.
evidence.
Well, and plus
And I should
those,
mention,
I was going to say,
go ahead.
plus those examples, I think help conceptualize the concept for people who are like, I'm not really sure about the point you're trying to make here. It's like, well,
Good.
let me bring it over into these other examples so that you can see how, if this played out in, say, a court of law, which personally I love shows about that and legal and all this kind of stuff. So I think that's really cool. I think that if you put it into a court of law, because that's what this is, right? It's testimony after testimony after testimony after testimony that you're kind of accumulating and building a case on, and then making decisions from there.
Corroborated testimony, I'd say.
Yeah. Not all
Where
of
you're
it's
corroborating with
corroborated.
other things.
Yeah, not all of it's corroborated, but some of it is.
Yes. So that's 12 lines of evidence that convince me that at least some near-death experiences are true. I'm not saying that all of them are real. There are people who have mental issues. There are people who this is just another day for them to have an experience like this because they're regularly talking to God and angels and people, and maybe they have a mental issue. There are people who are trying to sell a book desperately and they just made up a bunch of stuff. So I don't believe every experience I hear, but I
No.
believe because of these lines of evidence that a lot of them I really have good reasons, good solid reasons to believe they are experiencing something on the other side. And I should mention that after I wrote this book, so this was in my book on first book, near death experiences as evidence for the existence of God in heaven. So I go into that in more depth than we talked about here. Those 12. But since I wrote my book, people have mentioned other things that would be strange from a naturalistic standpoint. Charlie mentioned it in relation to another line of evidence, the ineffability. How that really is an evidence in itself. If it's something you can't describe, it that's happening on the other side, and many of these things are, they'll say, "Oh, it was kind of like a tunnel. I'll call it a tunnel, but it's not like any tunnel I've ever experienced." You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Or we were talking, but we wasn't really talking. We were just like we were directly communicating mind to mind. Those are things that we don't experience in our own lives, and yet we experience on the other side. I think that's more consistent with something that is real rather than something that our brain just brought up because of past experience. If it's ineffable, it's something we've not experienced before. And number 14, I would say, is that they've never been wrong on that question at the end when they say, "Do you want to come back or do you want to stay here?" And they may have a conversation with angelic beings or with God or with Jesus or someone about, is it my time yet? If it were a purely naturalistic thing, we ought to find a lot of people who say, okay,
Mm. Yeah, that's a good
let's
point.
stay.
Yeah.
And I decide to stay. The angel says, okay, come on over and stay. And then you wake up on the operating
Right.
table.
And you're disappointed in the outcome. Yeah.
Out of thousands of experiences probably that I've read about, I've never seen one like that. It's always that if they have this conversation, they decide to come back, they come back. Why is it always accurate? Under naturalism, you ought to have a lot of people who, if it's just a dream, just a hallucination, your brain inventing something, I think I would want to invent that I'm going to stay on the other side. I mean, that's much more fun. And a lot of them
Yeah.
would prefer to stay the other side. If it's my expectations and what I want, I'm going to the other side. I'm going to go on to be with heaven. But none of them ever get it wrong. Why? More consistent with the afterlife hypothesis.
Or you could just be facetious, Steve, and say that the ones who say that they want to stay are the ones who stay dead. So
I'll have to think about that one. You're getting really deep and philosophical. I'll get out my philosophical pipe and smoke on that one a little
yeah.
bit.
Well, hey guys, we're gonna go ahead and end today's episode. This was awesome. I do want to go into a line of evidence in the future that that's actual the experiences themselves actually have a pattern, and it's something I'm exploring in my new book, Afterlife Apologetics. The GLOVE acronym kind of breaks out and explains this pattern. So I think that the fact that there's a pattern at all is its own line of evidence. So, but something we'll look forward to do to get into it next week, guys. We really appreciate you showing up to these. If you ever have questions, comment. Steve and I love to engage with the comment section in terms of what questions you guys have about the experiences. And of course, we're going to be here every Tuesday, 2 Eastern, 12 Mountain Standard Time. Those are our 2 time zones, but you guys can translate them over into wherever you're at. But we look forward to seeing you guys here for the next episode next week. In the interim, God bless. And thank you guys for showing up for today's episode. All right.
Thanks for the conversation.